I am joined today by White House correspondent John Decker for a conversation about the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. Before I introduce John, I would like to thank our partners who made this event possible. This is truly a transatlantic event. If I'm not mistaken, we're spanning 10 time zones right now. So all the way on the west coast of the US, we are joined by the Swedish-American Chamber of Commerce in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley. John is based in Washington, DC. I'm here in Brussels, Belgium, and we're also joined by our colleagues at AmCham Czech Republic, AmCham Hungary, AmCham Bulgaria, and AmCham Romania. So thank you everybody for coming out today and joining the conversation and for supporting this event. Our guest speaker today is John Decker, White House correspondent and senior national editor at Gray Television. John has been a member of the White House press corps since 1995. So President Biden is his fifth president that he's covering, if I'm not mistaken. And fun fact about John, he is the only lawyer in the White House press corps. John has previously reported for Fox News Radio, Sirius XM Radio, Reuters Television, PBS Television, and NBC. And in addition to his work in journalism, he's also professor at Georgetown University and the UCLA School of Law. John, thank you so much for joining us today. It's great to see you again. We spoke in September about the elections. At that point in time, if I remember well, you predicted that Joe Biden would win the popular vote and that Wisconsin would be the decisive state in the Electoral College. President Biden, in fact, won Wisconsin, and I think he surprised all of us by also winning Georgia and Arizona. President Biden and Vice President Harris were inaugurated on January 20th of this year, and they completed their first 100 days in office on April 30th, so 2 weeks ago. In US politics, at least since the 1930s and President Roosevelt, the first 100 days of a new presidency have held symbolic importance. The president wants to build on the momentum of the election to launch big initiatives and also to set the tone and priorities for the next 4 years. And President Biden has been no exception. John will fill us in on the details of what he's been up to these past 100 days. And of course, President Biden also has an interest to act quickly while he has a majority in both houses of Congress. John will also fill us in on what to expect in the next 2 years up until the midterm elections in 2022. Before I give the floor to John, just some ground rules. Please, if you haven't already, mute yourself during the presentation. John will speak for about 25 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to the discussion. You can either ask your question through the chat, and I'll pick it up, or if you would like to ask the question directly to John, you can raise your virtual hand, and we will call on you to ask your question. Without further ado, John, I give the floor to you.
Daniel, thank you so much. And thank you for putting this great event together. It's so nice to talk to so many friends that I've built up some great working relationships over the years. And thank you to all the AmChams who are watching this event in Belgium, in Romania, in Bulgaria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and out on the US West Coast, the Swedish-American Chamber of Commerce in San Francisco and the Silicon Valley. Thank you to all of you for watching this presentation, and hopefully I'll answer a lot of your questions in the course of my presentation, but if you have some questions after I make my presentation, happy to answer anything that you may have. What I wanted to do is to show you some quick slides, short slideshow, just to bring you up to speed in terms of where we are and why we got to where we are with President Biden in the Oval Office, and then talk a little bit about the next 2 years and what we can expect over the next 2 years with President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris. So let's go to the first slide. And the first slide shows you what happened 4 years ago. That was in 2016. Can we go to the very first slide? So the first slide shows you 2016, 4 years ago, of course, President Trump surprised a lot of people in terms of winning the presidency. I did a presentation to AmCham EU at the time and made a prediction, a forecast that looks exactly like this chart that you're looking right here. And very few people could have forecast that Donald Trump would have won 4 years ago, but he won in large part by flipping states that traditionally had been so-called blue states and turning them red, namely Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. That he won them by very small margins, but he won them and won enough electoral votes, 306 to 232, to win the presidency. And of course, 4 years later, President Trump and Mike Pence are trying to replicate that. So let's move forward to slide number 2. And I'll go through these rather quickly. You see, it's a complete reversal in terms of the winner and the loser 4 years later. 4 years later, same number, 306 to 232, but this time it's Democrats who have 306 and it's Republicans who have 232. And as Daniel mentioned in his great introduction, the reason for that is those blue states that were won by President Trump in 2016, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, flipped back. They were won by Joe Biden in 2020. And we'll go through some details about why that happened. And then also, as Daniel mentioned in his introduction, 2 states that surprised a lot of people flipped from red to blue. They were surprises that Arizona went for Joe Biden. That was after a recount happening there in the state of Arizona, but enough Arizonans supported President Biden to give him those electoral votes. And also in the state of Georgia, there were 2 recounts that happened in the state of Georgia. But once again, that was a state that surprised a lot of people, went for Joe Biden in 2020, and that provided that cushion for him and his victory in 2020 in November. Let's go to the next slide, please. The next slide breaks it down. And I mentioned those 3 states. And if you happen to see my presentation ahead of the 2020 presidential campaign, I spoke about how these 3 states would determine the winner of the 2020 election, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. So in 2016, you see what happened here. President Trump won all 3 states, but he won them by less than 1% in each of those states. Pennsylvania by 44,000, Wisconsin by almost 23,000, and Michigan by just 11,000 votes. In fact, in Michigan, I, a few years ago, had lunch with U.S. Ambassador to the Netherlands, who used to be a congressman from Michigan and was running President Trump's campaign in Michigan. And he told me that even he was surprised that President Trump won the state of Michigan in 2016. But, you know, look what it landed him. It landed him in the position of being U.S. ambassador to the Netherlands. So it worked out well for him. 4 years later, in November, just less than half a year ago, or a little over half a year ago, a reversal. Joe Biden goes and campaigns in these 3 states, realizes these 3 states are so important to determining the victor in the 2020 presidential election. And you see the difference. It's a complete reversal. In Pennsylvania, Biden wins by 80,000 plus votes. In Wisconsin, by nearly 21,000 votes. And in Michigan, you can see he really performed, or outperformed, you could say, in Michigan, winning by over 154,000 votes in the state of Michigan. And why? Why did this all happen? Why the reversal of what we saw 4 years ago? Well, in each of these 3 states, different reasons, but some of them overlapped with each other. In Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, there are 3 commonalities. One is the African-American vote. In Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, the largest city in Pennsylvania, came out overwhelmingly for Joe Biden. That helped him out tremendously in winning the state of Pennsylvania. In Wisconsin, Milwaukee, again, the largest city in Wisconsin with a large African-American population, came out in record numbers for Joe Biden. And also in Michigan, Detroit, the largest city in Michigan, large population of African-Americans came out in large numbers for Joe Biden. The other reason is the suburban vote. suburban voters in 2016 took a chance, so to speak, on Donald Trump, an unknown, a person who had never run for political office before, a person who wasn't a politician. But 4 years later, it was pretty clear that in many parts of the country, but particularly in suburban areas outside major cities, like in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, those suburban voters decided they had enough of Donald Trump, and they voted for the ticket of Biden-Harris. And that was another reason why Joe Biden was able to win in each of those 3 states. And the other reason, lastly, has to do particularly in Wisconsin and Michigan, the coronavirus pandemic, COVID, particularly bad in the Midwest as we had the lead up to the November election. And voters in those states in particular were displeased with the response coming from the Trump-Pence administration. And they showed their displeasure by voting against Donald Trump at the ballot box in November. And so those are, I think, the critical reasons why Joe Biden managed to win in those 3 states. As it is often said about elections, they're often about timing. And the timing was just right for Joe Biden. In the same way, the timing was just right for Donald Trump in 2016. In 2016, I think voters wanted to try something new. They wanted to try someone who was not from Washington, who was not a politician, who was an outsider. So the timing was right for someone like Donald Trump in 2016, but the timing was obviously right for Joe Biden in November 2020. And so that gives you a good sense about why this election turned out the way it did as far as the Electoral College is concerned. If we can go to the next slide, I'll break this down for you very quickly as well. It's the popular vote. And you can see here in the popular vote what happened in 2016 on the left-hand side of your screen. Hillary Clinton won by nearly 3 million votes in 2016. As you know, in America, we do not determine the winner of the White House, the winner of the presidency by the popular vote. We do so by the Electoral College, but this is instructive in terms of how the majority of Americans felt in this or in the election of 4 years ago. And so Hillary Clinton has a feather in her cap for winning the popular vote, but she's quite disappointed because she didn't win the Electoral College 4 years ago. That's what counts. And so she won by 3 million, but that does not mean that she won the presidency. Fast forward 4 years, you see the popular vote total, Biden, Trump, and you see a 7 million plus margin of victory by Joe Biden for all of the AmChams that are watching this presentation. You all know that during the presentation, I made a forecast, and the forecast was that Joe Biden would win the presidency from anywhere between 5 million and 7 million votes. And I made that prediction come true, or at least the American public made that prediction come true in terms of what you saw in November. And the reason for that large number that we see there is because of huge vote totals that came out in support of Biden in the states that are quite large, that are blue states. And that is California, where President Biden won by over 25% in the November election. That counts for a lot. And also in New York State, where also Joe Biden won by double digits. It also helped that he also performed quite well in the state of Illinois, another state with a large population. So that's the reason for that right there. As it relates to the popular vote, again, it's what typically happens in an election. There have been instances where that has not happened, but typically the winner of the popular vote is also the winner of the Electoral College. But as we saw in 2016, as we saw in 2000 with Al Gore winning the popular vote but losing the Electoral College, sometimes this is not the case. Let's move on to our final slide. And this final slide is the slide that I think most of you are most interested in, and that is looking ahead, looking to the future, what we can expect over the next 2 years and what we've already seen take place so far in this first 100 plus days of the Biden-Harris administration. And so what I did was I broke it down by, I guess you can call it sectors, to think about what are the most important sectors for the AmChams that are watching right now. And they're in no particular order, but I'll go down these bullet points as you see them there on your screen. So first, in foreign policy, I think a big focus of President Biden, a big focus of his administration is rebuilding ties with Europe, with NATO and the World Health Organization. And we saw that literally in President Biden's first week in office. He made it quite clear in phone calls, in comments, in statements, in actions that he wanted to improve those ties that have traditionally been very strong between the US and Europe. And so one of the things that we saw is the US rejoining the World Health Organization. That's the WHO that President Trump removed the US from during the coronavirus pandemic. And also statements being made by President Biden and his Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, which signaled that the US will once again partner with Europe and partner with NATO on so many important issues, whether they be strategic issues or whether they be trade issues. As you know, and we'll talk a little bit about this in manufacturing, those trade tariffs that were put in place by the Trump administration are still in place during the Biden administration. But as I'll talk a little bit later in this slide, I don't think they're going to be there for that much longer. On energy, as you saw from the start, President Biden followed through with his campaign pledge of having a climate agenda that is in line with what the White House views as the rest of the world. A big part of that, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, and doing some other things that also indicate that the Biden administration is focused on this aggressive climate agenda. Those include starting negotiations for new climate rules for cars and trucks, and slowing or halting oil leases on federal lands. On the first thing that I mentioned, the climate rules for cars and trucks, we're already seeing automakers around the world, whether they be based in the US or in Europe or in Asia, already looking ahead for the next 10, 15, 20 years. And each of those automakers in each of those parts of the world has already made a commitment to having the vast majority of their fleets being electric, or all of their fleets being electric by a date certain. For some of them, it's the end of this decade. For some of them, it's the middle of next decade or the end of next decade. But indeed, automakers are following through on some commitments that they've made to lower their carbon footprint. On corporate taxes, we already have seen what President Biden wants to do. He has unveiled an infrastructure spending program that is pretty expensive, very ambitious, $2.3 trillion. And how do you pay for it? You pay for it by increasing corporate taxes from 21 to 28%. And during the Trump administration, those corporate tax rates were actually lowered in the first year of the Trump administration from 35 to 21%. President Biden wants to increase them. We'll talk about the likelihood of that actually happening during our Q&A talk for sure. But that rate increase depends on the Senate. The Senate is divided 50-50. And we know that one senator in particular, it's a Democrat from the state of West Virginia, Joe Manchin, has already indicated that he is not in favor of raising the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. He says that he's more comfortable with a 25% corporate tax rate. So we'll see how those negotiations go. Negotiations will continue this week at the White House with some Republican senators. And in fact, yesterday, President Biden met with Joe Manchin at the White House in regards to this very issue. On autos, there is a push for a focus on electric and also stricter auto emissions. We see this already so far. This is following through on campaign pledges made by President Biden when he was a candidate. On technology, big tech, I write, has an ally now on H1b visas. These are the visas for highly skilled individuals in Silicon Valley. So for our friends out on the West Coast watching the Swedish-American Chamber of Commerce, this should be good news for you. And I say it has an ally now in the White House because of Kamala Harris, who has built up very strong relationships with Silicon Valley in the years that she served as a district attorney from San Francisco, the attorney general from California, a US senator from California, and of course now as vice president. I mentioned manufacturing or touched on manufacturing, and let me just go a little bit more into detail. I mentioned an easing of trade tariffs and trade restrictions. I do anticipate that will happen. I do anticipate that will happen as it relates to Europe. I don't anticipate that will happen as it relates to China. I think that the tough line that the Biden administration saw the Trump administration take toward China will be continued. I don't think you're going to see any major differences in their approaches towards China. Certainly over the course of the next 2 years, a lot can change, but right now we see that relations are not very good right now between the US and China. And I think what the Biden administration would like to see happen is the US cooperate with the EU in using our collective so-called bargaining power in trying to impose tough trade deals with the Chinese. I want to touch upon our US relations with Russia as well, and perhaps we can do that during our Q&A. On agriculture and on banking, more regulation is expected. The thing with regulation is that you can do that type of thing without having to go through Congress. You can do that unilaterally in the executive branch. You don't need to have legislation passed by Congress to heighten or tighten regulations. And you're going to see that in both of those sectors in the Biden administration. And lastly, on the issue of pharmaceuticals, because I wanted to wrap up in my 25-minute time period, so we have questions. The cost and affordability of medications, something that President Trump actually focused on during his 4 years in office, also something that President Biden says that he will focus on and has focused on. He's renewing efforts to lower the costs of those prescription drugs. And he's also proposed that the government directly negotiate with drug makers for discounts on medication. Medicare does not allow that to happen. So I wanted to touch on that last sector just because I know there are some AmCham members in Europe that certainly fall in the pharmaceutical sector. So that's my overview of the administration, what they've done so far in this first 100 days, what they anticipate doing over the next 2 years. And we use 2 years as a time frame because next year, November, will be the midterm elections, and those elections will determine who controls the House and who controls the Senate. And obviously, we see a very close makeup right now of both the House and the Senate, and I think it's going to be very close also, even after the midterm elections next year. So with that, Daniel, I throw it back to you as our moderator, and happy to take any questions from anyone in our vast audience on any particular subject that you have. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, John, for that excellent overview of the elections, but also the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. I have a few questions I would like to throw at you just to get the conversation started as questions from the audience slowly start to come in. I'll start with a softball question for you.
Okay.
So last week, I attended a webinar where a professor from Johns Hopkins University, Dan Hamilton, was speaking, and he described President Biden as the most transatlantic president since Eisenhower. I was wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Well, I don't know. I think it's a work in progress. You know, it's a little bit too early to, make those give those types of monikers to anybody just less than 100 days into their presidency. But there's no doubt about the fact that, as I said in my presentation, President Biden does want to improve drastically relations between the US and Europe. between the US and the European Union. And the reason being is because I think you can say for certain that relations really hit a low during the Trump administration. The Trump administration did not necessarily see Europe as our natural allies. We saw this in trade policy, the trade tariffs policy. We saw this in President Trump. For every world leader from Europe that came to the White House that was a member of NATO, the insistence that they increase the amount of money that they pay to fund NATO, that was right out there in the open. It wasn't said behind closed doors. So President Biden does see himself as an internationalist. He does have great relations with many leaders in Europe, which is great when you have that relationship to build upon. And so I'm not going to say what that Johns Hopkins professor said because it's too early to say that, I think. But certainly I will say with certainty that relations already have been repaired and will continue to strengthen over the course of the next 2 years.
Thank you. I want to go back to trade policy and to tariffs. So you mentioned that you expect President Biden to lift the tariffs on steel and aluminum that President Trump put into place. We already saw a few months ago that the US and the EU agreed for a period of 4 months to put on hold all tariffs related to the Boeing Airbus disputes, which is a signal of goodwill. Do you think there's going to be agreement or possibility over the next 4 years for there to be some sort of trade agreement between the US and EU? Is there an appetite to perhaps come back to the TTIP negotiations from President Obama? Or is there not really an appetite for free trade agreements right now in the US?
Well, what you've noticed, Daniel, and everybody else has noticed, is that there are so many individuals that populate the Biden administration that worked in the Obama administration. And so a lot of the same approaches towards trade, a lot of the same approaches towards Europe are going to be and have been approaches that we've seen so far on the Biden team. And so over the next 4 years, I do anticipate multilateral agreements being reached between the Biden administration and Europe. As you know, during the Trump years, President Trump was against multilateral agreements. He pulled the US out of our commitments to both the Trans-Pacific Partnership and in addition to that, TTIP, as you mentioned. And the reason being is he felt that bilateral deals were better for the United States than multilateral deals. That's not the same approach by President Biden. Let's make no mistake about it. I don't think that on one day over the course of the next month or two, trade tariffs are just going to miraculously be removed as it relates to Europe. But I do think that relations are improving in such a way and at such a pace that over the course, I would say, of the next year, that's reasonable, that those tariffs will be done away with. Those tariffs on steel, imported steel and aluminum, the other tariffs that we saw the Trump administration impose upon a variety of European products, they're also going to go away. But as I mentioned, with China, they're not going to go away. Relations are at a real low with China right now. And the Biden administration wants there to be no daylight at all between his approach to China and the approach that President Trump had towards China and Republicans as a party have towards China. They want a tough line. China was one of those rare instances or rare areas, Daniel, where there was bipartisan support during the Trump years. Chuck Schumer praised Donald Trump for his approach towards China and told him to keep it up. And so that's the reason why I say that President Biden's approach towards China is going to be as hard, if not harder, over the course of his presidency.
I'd also like to come back to the discussion about corporate taxation. So as you mentioned, the administration has proposed to raise taxes or the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%, but it's far from certain that will be approved by the Senate. So there's a question coming in about what is the timeline for those negotiations? When might we expect there to be an actual agreement and the law coming into effect? Do you have any idea on that?
Yeah, I do. So I can give you a short-term timeline and then a timeline beyond that. So negotiations are ongoing. Here we are at the beginning part of May. And I think that I know that the Biden administration has a deadline of these negotiations with Republicans running the course of this month. by our Memorial Day, by the end of this month, they want those negotiations to lead to at least one Republican signing on to this infrastructure spending plan, which is very ambitious, $2.3 trillion. I think that deadline's going to come and go, actually. There are meetings that are taking place at the White House this week involving Republican senators that have put forward a counter proposal that is a quarter of the size of the Biden infrastructure spending proposal, $538 billion versus $2.3 trillion. There's a wide gulf between the two sides, as you clearly can see. And I think that what will likely happen, this is my forecast, is that you won't have any Republicans sign on to this. And that's what happened with the COVID relief bill that was passed in a very short time frame since President Biden took office. That was $1.9 trillion. It passed the House and it passed the Senate without any Republican support. And that's what the Biden administration would like to do with the infrastructure spending bill if they get no Republican support for that. And that's where we're heading. The big unknown is a few senators like Joe Manchin who are not on board aspects, the scope and the size of this plan. And so he's the wild card. That's the reason why he met one-on-one with President Biden yesterday at the White House. When I spoke to Vice President Harris last week. I traveled with Vice President Harris on Air Force Two for a day trip that she did to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And she said they're going to keep up. She's going to keep up conversations with her former colleagues in the Senate. And I think that's important, but I don't see any movement. I don't see any compromise by either side. I don't see Republicans coming up from their number, nor do I see the Biden administration, the White House, coming down from their number. And as a result, I just don't see between now and the end of the month any agreement with Republicans on an infrastructure spending plan. And so that's the short term. Then the long term, as I mentioned, Daniel, that will be an effort that will be difficult by the Biden White House to try to pass this infrastructure spending bill. They can do it in the House. They have the numbers. That's not a problem. But in the Senate, that means getting a senator like Joe Manchin on board, a senator like Kristen Sinema, who's up for re-election in 2022, on board, and their wild cards. And I just can't predict what they may or may not do as it relates to that piece of legislation.
One follow-up question about corporate taxation that you haven't mentioned yet. A couple of weeks ago, the Secretary of Treasury, Janet Yellen, announced her support for a global minimum corporate tax rate of 21%, which I think is very important for many AmCham members, including our own. So I'm sure they would love to hear your thoughts on the negotiations at the OECD level and what it means now that the US supports a global minimum corporate tax level.
It's a great question. There are two things that I didn't mention when I mentioned that corporate tax rate. One is what you just mentioned. President Biden, through his Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has imposed a new minimum tax on US companies. That's number one. And also raising taxes on the foreign income of many US-based multinational corporations. These are hard things to do. They're hard things to do in terms of changing the corporate tax structure, especially after the corporate tax structure in this country changed just a few years ago, in 2017, in the first year of President Trump's year in office. To do this, you need unity in the Democratic Party. And to do this, I just don't see that kind of unity right now in the Democratic Party. Things can change, different pressures are brought to bear on different members of the Senate in particular. That's where all the pressure needs to be brought to bear. That's where all the action will need to happen. Right now, I just don't see changes happening as it relates to those two particular corporate tax issues.
Right. Moving on to a different topic, as you mentioned, since really day one in office, President Biden has made it a point of attention to rebuild relations with Europe. I think we're all very pleased that he's chosen to come to Europe for his first international trip in June. So he'll be in Wales, and then he's coming to Brussels, actually. We're very happy about that. But the reverse is not true. So there's a lot of concern so far that Europeans still, more than a year later, cannot travel to the US. So the travel ban is still in effect if you've been in the Schengen area for the previous 2 weeks. And so do you have any indication if that travel ban might be lifted in the near future now that vaccination is progressing?
I ask this question, Daniel, almost every week. And the reason I ask it, not only for personal reasons, but I ask it on behalf of people like you that ask me that very question. And I still don't have a date or a timeline for that. Our situation in the US is improving. It's improving quite a bit. And I think that what the health professionals do at the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, that give advice to the president on these particular issues, is they just evaluate how are things going in Europe to open up the US to the Schengen zone travelers in particular. And so I don't have, I wish I did, to provide to all of our AmCham members a definite answer to that. But that's a question that I continue to ask regularly. And I can update you after we're done our AmCham event to give you the latest updates that I receive and just forward them to all of my contacts at the various AmChams to provide you the latest information on that particular topic.
Perhaps a follow-up question on that is if you have any insight on the appointment of ambassadors. So far, at least in Europe, I don't think any ambassadors have been appointed. I know they're still doing some domestic appointments. So do you have any insight on when they might start appointing ambassadors for the US?
Yeah, so there was already a first wave of ambassadors that was announced, and those first wave of ambassadors are for countries that are not in Europe. And so that's the reason why you're asking me this question. Yeah. Typically, as you know, the European ambassadors are political appointees. They're not career foreign service officers. And so that process, as you may recall, from 2017 when President Trump was naming his ambassadors, and from 2009 when President Obama was naming his ambassadors, you need to go through this vetting process. And that vetting process takes time. And it means that it can be a matter of weeks, if not months, before those ambassadors are named by the Biden administration. We're getting word about some names that could be in store for posts in Europe, but nothing that has been confirmed yet. And so I'll continue to follow that very closely. Obviously, our embassies are staffed all throughout Europe by very bright career service, foreign service individuals who can certainly take care of all matters as it relates to topics related to the US and Europe. But obviously, you want an ambassador in place, and you want an ambassador that has the ear of the White House, the ear of the president. And so that's why it's taking a little bit more time to make certain that those people are vetted. They can be confirmed in the Senate. You don't want any issues where you have an individual being brought up that is controversial. We've seen some Biden appointees lose in their confirmation battles in the Senate. With a 50-50 Senate, you have to be really certain that you have every Democrat on board at the very least. So I would expect that within the next, I would say 2 months or so, you're going to see that second round of ambassadors being named by the Biden administration. And then, of course, once they're named, then they have to go through the actual confirmation process, a confirmation hearing in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then a vote on the full Senate floor.
Yes, very good. I also want to come back to technology companies, into digital economy. You mentioned in your presentation H1b visas, but I think what's a concern to many of our companies is actually the transfer of data across the Atlantic. So at least since last summer, when the European Court of Justice struck down the Privacy Shield, there hasn't really been a firm legal basis for companies who do business in Europe and the US to transfer data between both jurisdictions. There's negotiations ongoing, we know, but there's not a lot of indications of how they're progressing. Do you have any insight on how that's going right now?
Well, I have insight in terms of the way that President Biden views these issues. And he views these issues a little bit differently, actually, than President Obama. who was pretty laissez-faire on these particular issues. President Biden has emphasized concerns about both competitive practices and privacy. And so in that regard, I think he's more in line with the thinking of the EU regulators than, for instance, President Obama's administration was on these particular issues. And there could be some cooperation in that regard. That I think is important. And so despite the fact what I mentioned a little bit earlier about Kamala Harris, the vice president, having these really great ties with Silicon Valley, as we all know, the vice president follows the policies of the president. And we know the president's views on this, they're a little bit different than the vice president's views in those particular areas. And so I can't give you a definitive idea about the when, the how, but as these policies are formulated at the USTR's office, the United States Trade Representative's office, also through Paris, the OECD, you'll see those policies being announced by the administration.
We have a question about the pharmaceutical industry. So last week, I believe it was, the US administration kind of dropped a bombshell saying that they would support lifting IP protection for COVID-19 vaccines. I think they caught Europe a bit on the back foot with that announcement. And so the question is kind of what was behind that thinking? How does it affect companies operating here in Europe? And kind of why weren't allies consulted before this announcement was made?
Yeah, those are all good questions. And I think that the administration put forward their thinking on this before discussing this idea with all of the stakeholders involved. And as a result, you see pushback coming from various sectors, various allies on this. I saw, in fact, an editorial today in the Wall Street Journal written by the former FDA commissioner under President Trump, very well-respected individual, saying this is a terrible idea. So despite the fact that the Biden administration made that announcement last week, I don't think it's set in stone. I think there's the great likelihood that they pull back from that statement that was made last week, given the reaction from all of the stakeholders that are involved in this particular issue and the reaction from our European allies.
Thank you. You mentioned during your presentation that you would come back to Russia, and there's a question about Russia. So if you want to expand a bit on how the Biden administration views the relationship with Russia, that would be great.
Yeah, so this is, as you know, a very difficult relationship. It was difficult during the Trump years to a certain extent, difficult during the Obama years as well, and it's continued during President Biden's first 100 days in office. What we have seen so far is President Biden has taken a much harder tack in terms of rhetoric towards Russia than did President Trump. As you know, President Trump was reluctant to criticize President Putin by name at any point when asked a question during his 4 years in office. You may have seen an interview in which President Biden agreed with the statement that President Putin is a killer, which raised a lot of eyebrows, not very diplomatic language, so to speak. So the rhetoric's tougher. I think the approach will be tougher. And we already saw, despite, those two tough approaches, that President Biden, even yesterday, once again reached out and said it's important that the leaders of the United States and Russia speak to one another. And so there's an offer on the table for a summit happening in Europe this summer. It may be during the time period that President Biden is in Europe. As you mentioned, in your introduction, that President Biden will be in Europe, of course, for the NATO summit and other events as well. So we still not have a word back from President Putin as to whether or not he'll accept that invitation to talk face to face. And that's important. President Putin has met face to face with every president since George W. Bush, and I would anticipate that will also be the case with President Biden. I just simply don't know when or where that will happen.
Perhaps a related question then is Iran. So there are negotiations going on right now trying to get Iran and the US back at the table. I think they're in Vienna this week talking about it. Yeah. Do you think there's any hope of progress on kind of going back to the nuclear deal, or is that going to be a hard sell in the US?
Well, it was a hard sell last time. Just let's take a look back in time. You actually had the leader for Democrats in the Senate, Chuck Schumer, and the president of the United States, Barack Obama, both Democrats, harshly criticizing each other in public in regards to their stances that they took on the Iran nuclear deal. So that's something that, the Biden administration has to now contend with, because the majority leader in the Senate is Chuck Schumer, who is critical of the first deal. So the talks continue. That's something that President Biden hinted that he would do when he was running as a candidate for president. He's followed through on that commitment. The talks continue in Vienna. I think that the administration would very much like to have Iran back with the other countries that are signatories to the Iran nuclear deal, and we'll see how those talks progress. But as I mentioned, the same people that were involved to a large extent in the foreign policy of the Obama administration are now involved in the foreign policy of the Biden administration, and they were all giving high fives to each other after the Iran nuclear deal was reached. And that gives you a sense about why they want Iran back in the fold and why they want another deal involving Iran. So I think those negotiations continue, mindful, of course, that you have Democrats like Chuck Schumer who are wary of such a deal. And I think that this is one of those instances where they would need to run things by him to make certain that, they have his approval.
Thank you. One of the other really hot topics these days is climate diplomacy and climate change. So we've seen a few weeks ago, the US pledged to reduce emissions by 50% by 2030, if I'm not mistaken. And the climate envoy, John Kerry, has been very, very busy traveling the world, making agreements with allies. In Europe, we have what's called the Green Deal. And so there seems to be some alignment, as you mentioned in your presentation earlier, on the US ambition and EU ambitions, that there's some slow alignment on this front. And perhaps you want to elaborate a bit further on climate diplomacy and how you see that unfolding in the US. It's still, I think from our perspective, it's very ambitious. It's a great thing the US is doing it, but it's very new for the US as well to commit to such a high reduction rate.
It is very ambitious. That was part, by the way, of the message that Vice President Harris was delivering in the Midwest when I traveled with her last week. And that is the message that the future for the US economy, the future for the world economy is a clean energy approach. And she was trying to make it clear to the Midwest in particular, where our auto industry is based, that there is a future for those workers that now work in industries that rely so much on a large carbon footprint. That's been a tough sell. It's also the message that President Biden delivered when he traveled down to Louisiana, which is big in the energy sector. That was also last week. And it's been a tough sell. I speak to Gray Television. For those of you who don't know, I used to be at Fox, but Gray Television is the second largest television broadcaster in the US. We just concluded a deal last week that makes us in more markets around the US. I think it's 116 markets around the US. And so I hear this from our affiliates all over the country, the concern about what the future may hold under this clean energy agenda. But the Biden administration, wholly believes in this. The reason why there's a climate czar, the former Secretary of State John Kerry, is because President Biden believes in this. That two-day climate summit that happened, that was led by President Biden just a few weeks ago, is an indication. That commitment that the U.S. has made is an indication of our commitment. I think the concern that Europe has is that, as you know, things change with the new administration. So this is the approach of the Biden administration. This will be the approach of the Biden administration. It will not, fall back over the next 4 years. But what happens if a Republican wins the White House in 2024? That's the concern, I think, of Europe, that for all of these commitments, they go away if there's a Republican president in 2024. And that's just the reality of politics in the US. You can undo much of what your predecessor did. We see that with executive orders. We see this even with the US getting back into the Paris Climate Accord. And so for the time being, the US has made this commitment. This is a commitment that it will abide by. Our automakers are committed to following through on this. I think regardless of the administration, that's pretty clear to me. But I can understand the concerns coming from Europe, given the fact that politics can, move one way or another based upon an election.
Of course. We have perhaps one more policy question before we move into politics, actually.
Yeah, sure.
Which is about the banking sector. So do you have any insight on any changes to banking regulations and how that might change under the Biden administration?
Yeah, so I do, but for the AmCham members that are watching this, most of those changes are involved in domestic regulations, not so much international regulations. So the early focus is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That's really domestic politics. And there the focus is on payday lenders and debt collectors. So you will not see anything of note as it relates to that heightened regulation affecting international banking. It will mostly be heightened regulation as it relates to those particular areas on the domestic banking sector.
Thank you. Then perhaps in the last 5 minutes, we move into politics.
Yes.
There's been quite a few questions about that. One that's come up a few times already is kind of how you see the lasting legacy of President Trump on the Republican Party.
Well, it's so soon. I mean, it's 100 days, into the Biden administration, which means we're 100 days removed from the Trump administration. And I make this point quite a bit. I'm not weighing in politically how I feel about anything. I'm just stating a fact. And the fact is that right now, even though President Trump he lost the presidential election in November, he's still the leader of the Republican Party, which is just a remarkable thing. The last leader of the Republican Party to lose a presidential election was George H.W. Bush in 1992. And after he lost, he was nobody, essentially. He was an elder statesman, but he certainly wasn't the leader of the Republican Party. That's not the case with President Trump. He still holds a lot of sway over the party. In fact, a vote will take place tomorrow in the House of Representatives in which the number 3 leader in the House of Representatives for Republicans, Liz Cheney, is going to be removed from her position. She's going to be voted out. And that's because President Trump has made it clear he has grown tired of her, so to speak. She voted to impeach him during the most recent impeachment that happened in February. I think that was the red line for him. And so she'll be removed from her leadership position. He'll be involved very much in the midterm elections, Republicans trying to win back control of the House and win back the Senate. But let me answer a question that might be a follow-up of yours, Daniel, and it's a logical follow-up. What about 2024? Is President Trump going to run again for the presidency? And my answer to that, because I'm asked that question quite a bit, my personal belief on that is no. I do not think he will run for president in 2024. I think he'd like to be president again, but I don't think he wants to go through the process of trying to win back the White House again. He's hinted that he's going to run again, but I think you do that. Otherwise, you become irrelevant. You have to, sort of keep that buzz alive around a candidacy so you're relevant. And that's exactly what he's doing. The primary reason I don't think he's going to run again is I've gotten to know President Trump quite well over the years. The first time I interviewed him was in 1999. I've interviewed him dozens of times, and this past election really hit him to his core. And I don't think he wants to risk being a two-time loser, to be quite honest. And not to say that he couldn't win, but he doesn't want to risk that possibility. And so I don't think he's going to run again in 2024. And you already see a number of well-known Republicans and some not well-known Republicans already making the necessary moves to run for the presidency in 2024.
But perhaps on a bit shorter time frame, 2022, we have midterm elections coming up. So as you already mentioned, the Democrats have a very slim majority in both houses currently, and they can very easily lose them in 2 years or maintain them. How do you see that happening? What's your prediction for 2022?
Yeah, so it's really early for 2022 to make a prediction. Having said that, historically, the party in power of the White House typically loses seats in the midterm elections. And with Democrats holding a very slim majority in the House of Representatives, that puts them in a very precarious situation heading into 2022. So I can't really make a prediction other than looking at history. On the Senate side, I've actually looked at this very closely, and it's a 50-50 Senate right now. And I think that what it all comes down to in 2022 is 2 Senate races in particular, just 2 Senate races. I think the race that will happen in Pennsylvania is one of them. There's a retiring Republican, and that's going to be a competitive race on both the Democratic and Republican side to be their respective nominees. And also in Ohio, there's a retiring Republican there, and Republicans obviously want to hold on to that seat. So I think that, you know, what we're looking at right now is a very close Congress between Republicans and Democrats existing no matter what the outcome in 2022. There's not going to be a landslide. There's not going to be an overwhelming majority by either party. It's going to continue to remain close. History, as I mentioned, it means that Democrats are on the defense in the House. And in the Senate, I think it just really boils down to 2 seats in the US Senate, and literally tens of millions of dollars will be poured into those races, as you can probably imagine.
I see that it's 6 o'clock already, but perhaps 1 or 2 last questions.
Sure, absolutely.
Political question for you. So President Biden came into office promising to reach across the aisle and work with Republicans. As you already mentioned, most of the things that have happened so far have really been along party lines. So is there any hope for bipartisanship in the US, or is that a pipe dream?
Well, bipartisanship on some issues, yes, absolutely. Will they be the big issues, the issues regarding taxing and spending? No, you're not going to get any bipartisanship on those types of big issues. But on issues, for instance, like police reform, I think that you could possibly see some bipartisanship here after, you know, the racial unrest that I know you watched from afar take place here in the US last summer. So that is one possibility for bipartisanship. And that can go a long way, obviously, if you can reach that type of agreement. There'll be some other things as well that will happen over the course of the next 2 years in which you can reach some bipartisan agreements, but they won't be the big issues that the AmCham members pay the most attention to, those tax and spend issues that affect all of your members.
Thank you. To the audience, are there any last burning questions that you would like to ask John while we have him? Anybody? If not, I would like to again thank all of our partners for this event. So the Swedish-American Chamber of Commerce in San Francisco in the Silicon Valley, AmCham Czech Republic, AmCham Hungary, AmCham Bulgaria, AmCham Romania, and most importantly, thank you to John Decker for joining us once again. It's always insightful to have you and have a discussion with you about US politics and what's happening in Washington. So thank you so much, John, for sharing your insider's view with us once again.
Daniel, thank you. Thank you to all of the AmChams involved, particularly AmCham Belgium, for organizing everything and getting all of the partnerships involved in this event. And it's great to see you virtually. I hope to see you each in person in due course. in Europe or here in Washington. It would be great to see one another and catch up. In the meantime, be well, stay healthy, and we'll talk real soon.
Will you be traveling with the president in June when he comes to Europe?
Yeah, I likely will be traveling, so perhaps we can find some time for those in AmCham Belgium to maybe get together. That'd be a nice thing, maybe a dinner of some sort, which would be
We should
nice.
stay in touch then.
We'll stay in touch. I'll give you the latest on my travels. And as I mentioned at the top of our conversation, it may have been online, I plan to travel in 2 weeks to Paris for Roland Garros. You can see I'm a little bit of a fan right behind me.
Yeah, we have a comment right now, somebody that likes your tennis rackets behind.
Yeah.
Belgian racket brands, yeah.
That's right. I'm well aware. That's right. A Belgian racket, and it was Borg's racket. So that's a really.
Unfortunately, they went bankrupt, so that's the sad thing of it.
I know, but it was a great company, a great racket, and it propelled Bjorn Borg to so many Grand Slam championships. So hopefully that trip works out. I'm just getting some final words from the French authorities. But in any case, I'll keep you apprised of my travels to Europe this summer, particularly to Belgium for the president's visit.
Great. Thank you so much, John. Everybody have a good day, have a good evening, stay safe, take care, and hopefully can we do this again.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.